Hello everyone, and it's finally time for the lecture. You're gonna like this one, I'm sure. It's famous Keres attack. It's against Sicilians with the most flexible setup d6, e6. And amongst all those variations after d6, the most popular is knight Earth, then the dragon, right after that Rouser, and then you have this e6, which is called Scheveningen variation. So, what is Keres attack and how does it appear? After a4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes, knight c3, and they go with e6. Special move is g4. First of all, I have to tell you that this e6 was applied by so many players in the past. Nowadays, Carlsen, Nakamura, Duda on regular basis play it. In the past, Kasparov, but not from this order of moves. Simply, he was afraid of Keres attack. What is Keres attack? Sixth move, g4. I remember that a Keres, first of all, this Keres attack is named after famous Paul Keres, who used this opening back to 1943 in his famous game against Bogolyubov. He crushed Bogolyubov in that game, and right after that game, this variation became so popular. Years later, many strong players followed this Keres attack and his paths, and they began to exploit his variation with very nice results, including Spassky, Fischer, and Karpov, whose games we're going to see in this lecture. The main idea of g4 is to kick the knight away with g5, and right after that, to first of all kick the knight away, so they're not going to have one of the most important defensive pieces, and it's the knight on f6. Second thing, you can carry on with typical h4 afterwards, followed by h5 and g6. Depending on circumstances over the board, your rook usually goes on h3 or on g1, while at the same time you can sometimes even go with f4 and f5. Light square bishop usually goes on h3 or on e2. Dark square bishop goes on e3 almost exclusively there, while the queen sometimes goes on d2. In many variations it goes on e2, but sometimes you also want to place that queen on g4 or h5, launching the attack. So many different plans, and that actually makes the Keres attack, with all its diversity, a very always popular and very attractive line. Get ready for something very nice, and let's go line by line. One of the worst moves after g4 is d5. From all the possibilities that I'm going to cover in tonight's lecture, d5 is probably the worst one. You of course have to take, they gotta capture, and then you just have to go with bishop b5 check. This bishop b5 check is a very important accuracy because they gotta go with bishop d7, and then you take on d5. When they play e takes d5, you just go queen e2. Extremely suspicious line for black, with lots of problems, because I'll show you a game of my student, Grandmaster Milan Zajic. A game was played last year, and his opponent played queen e7. Milanche, that's his nickname, played bishop e3, covering the e-file. He didn't want to exchange the queens, and after knight c6, he of course was preparing himself for the long castle. After g6, he played queen d2. What I like about queen d2, it's aimed against long castle, and this guy probably didn't even understand the point of that. So wants queen c3, but at the same time he threatens rook h to e1. When black tried to play long castle, putting his king in a safety, Milanche played knight c6, bishop c6, and played queen c3, threatening both rook on h8 and pawn on c6. Black resigned. What an easy game, and what an easy win. Now you see how my students play and win in 16 moves with this opening. After queen e2, bishop e7 is one of the possibilities, and here there is a special move for white to claim the initiative. It's knight f5, and knight f5 pins this bishop and in a way forces this king not to go for the castle. After king f8, he has to take on d7, play bishop e3, and go with the long castle. Threatening rook h to e1, queen f3. In some variations, you can always consider taking on e7 by the knight, what is completely winning. I believe that a sixth move d5 is almost refuted. Apart from d5, we gotta check bishop e7. Probably of all these moves, since d5 is pretty much forced, bishop e7 I don't like so much. What I don't like about bishop e7 and what I find kind of suspicious about this move is that they don't prevent this g5 move. I'm always happy as a Keres attack player that I have g5 with tempo kicking away this knight from the king's side and actually preparing myself afterwards for the attack. After knight f to d7, there are generally two possibilities. Whether you play bishop e3 now or later, it is going to transpose into those lines, so don't bother about that. Your dark square bishop, as I said in the beginning of this lecture, usually goes on, not usually, almost exclusively goes on a3. From another point of view, the real question is, should you be going with the plan with h4 or rook to g1? That's the difference, and that's what you have to understand about this one. Because if you go with h4, then you don't have plans and ideas that are coded with a rook g1, rook g3, rook h3, followed by queen h5. But if you go with h4, h5, and g6, then you need your rook being on h1 and you don't need it on g1 because in many of these variations you just need open h file and rook there. So that's the difference, and that's what that actually depends on your preferences during the game. I prefer h4 and I decided to show you this one because it's easier for remembering. It's quite typical, but at the same time always keep in mind, just for the sake of your, let's just say, richness in these type of games, so just to be like like to know like more different plans in this type of positions, remember this rook g1 supporting h4, h5, g6, but more importantly supporting rook g3, and once they castles, you just go with the queen h5 and rook h3 in many of these lines, going for direct checkmate. After you do h4, they just go with a knight c6 or a6. Those who do a6, nothing. They just want to play b5 at some point. And those who play b5 in some of these variations, they will have problems with e6 square because once they place this bishop on b7, they just weaken the pawn on e6. So we're going to try to take advantage of that. Second thing is that they can play this with b5, bishop b7, with or without knight c6. But usually when they allow knight f to d7, you just have to go, they just have to go with the knight on c6 afterwards. So you play bishop e3, and they go castles. If they play knight c6, my specialty here for you wouldn't be, you never play a queen g4 when the bishop is on c8. So queen g4 is not an option here, simply bishop is on c8. So you're not threatening e6, there are some x-rays against the queen on g4. You never play queen h5 when h4 is played because you don't have any longer possibility to go with a rook lifting, rook g1, rook g3, rook h3. And finally, you just go with either queen d2 or queen e2. Very typical move is queen d2. But my suggestion and the specialty for you is queen e2. What I find so special about queen e2 is that you keep an option of, placing the white queen on g4 and h5, on the light squares afterwards on the king's side. But at the same time, you keep an option of having an open d-file and some tactics on the d-file. So after bishop e3, they go castles. You go queen d2. It's a nice one. You just want to complete your development with the long castles. And now they have b5, followed by bishop b7, or they just go knight c6. I'll show you some very nice games. After knight c6, long castle, of course. Knight e4. I very much like a little bit unstandard reaction with the queen takes d4, which stops all kinds of counter chances by black there. So after b5, we now go with h5. That's a specialty, and that's the move that you have to remember. What I like about this move is, yes, we're hanging the pawn on g5, but can they really take it? So let me just show you what happens. After h5, I believe that the bishop b5, what happened in one correspondence game, is probably the best. Those who take on g5, you just carry on with the action with h6. You're now threatening queen g7 mate. If they take on a3 and play g6, you just take on d6. You just play queen d4, threatening mate on g7. They gotta play e5. You just play queen d5, threatening rook. Or threatening, actually, you're not threatening rook immediately because they can take the rook, but you threaten bishop h3 going after the knight. And going after the knight wins the game now, because once you move the knight, or once you take on d7, you're going to weaken the pawn on e5 and win the game. Also, piece is hanging here, so white is winning. In the case of h6, which deserves exclamation mark here for white, if they go with a bishop f6, Gashimov, great GM who unfortunately passed away very young, played one game where he played an interesting e5. I like this one. He's opening up e4 square for his queen and going after both king side and the rook on the queen side. So after bishop e5, queen e4, d5, he sacrificed, play queen d5, threatening rook, threatening h takes g7, and he won the game against Le Pelletier in the France 2006. But if you really want something better than e5, what Gashimov played in that game, and which I find interesting, it's queen d6. It's way better. You still threaten to take on g7, so they gotta go with g6, and in that case you just play f4. You threaten to play e5, and then you just go rook g1, and then you just have to choose whether you want to play e5 or f5, but practically they're completely lost. Instead of bishop takes g5, in that correspondence game that I want to show you was bishop b7. This guy played h6, threatening mate, e5, queen d2. Queen d2 does a good job because he defends the pawn on g5, but also keeps pressuring d6 and gives you knight e5 at a proper moment. After g6, you know how much we all like to put the king on b1 when we make the long castles. And I'll always, and I'm going to repeat it again, in 99% of the cases, it's going to be good. In 1% of the cases, you may suffer because of some king b1 after a long castle, but always we count on this theory of probability. So after rook b8, you just play f4, opening up the center, bishop f4, queen e3 threatening on e5, bishop h3 covering and actually preventing both rook c8. And after knight e5, rook takes d5, a beautiful control of the game by white, having all the most important squares in the center, on the d file, bishop pair. This guy cannot play any rook c8 at any point. There is no attack. White is practically completely winning. I'm just showing you a little bit faster these moves because after he exchanged, played rook d4, played b3 to open the king, to limit this knight, played rook c4, and after bishop e3, black resigned. All things considered, I believe that after bishop e7, g5, knight f2, d7, h4, we've seen enough with these lines where they go with a6 and b5. But what happens when they just play knight c6? It transposes into some other type of positions, but when they play knight c6, you just go with the bishop e3 and go with my specialty, queen e2. Well, I call it my specialty because I chose it for you, but the specialty is by somebody way more special and better than me, Anatoly Karpov himself. He played the following game against Dorfman in Moscow 1976, and after he played queen e2, he just transposed into the line that I showed you previously. So after queen e2, I just explained you, he just wants to make the long castle, in which case he's going to have some threats along the open d file. After queen c7, long castles b5. An old rule in the Sicilians is if they play and push this b5 and you have a possibility to take on c6, in which case they gotta capture by queen, you should always take advantage of it. And you'll see why. Karpov played bishop d4, and this guy didn't want to take his chances by making short castle because he would be destroyed there. But he played b4, like looking for his own counter chances in the game. Karpov played knight e5, and now you realize why knight c6 is such a special move in those positions. So, and why actually having the queen on c6 is a good thing when we play knight e5. After e takes d5, Karpov captured, intermezzo move, e takes d5 threatening this queen, played bishop f6 threatening on e7, and after knight e5 played bishop e5, f4, and the pretty sad position for black, because after he played bishop f5, of course, and he takes f4, d6 wins the game on the spot. But when he played bishop f5, Karpov played bishop h3. He was down a piece, but position was absolutely winning and dead lost for black. So Karpov won soon after that. We've seen so far two moves. We've seen d5 and bishop e7. It's time for another move. It's e5. e5 is one of those moves where they try to catch you off guard. So they try to attack both knight on d4 and pawn on g4. Answer is only one. You definitely have to defend both knight on d4 and pawn on g4, but first you need to include this intermezzo and a very important accuracy, bishop b5 check. Bishop b5 check, they can't play knight d7, they cannot play knight c6, so they have to play bishop d7. You exchange, and when they take by queen, and that's what a majority of the guys do, you just play knight f5. Now you have a great control, positional control of the game. You threaten bishop g5 followed by bishop f6, where your knights are going to dominate, so they have to play h5 and to break these pawns on the king side. When they play h5, we just take on h5. Now they have two possibilities, one which immediately loses. It's rook h5 because knight d5, and you're just using the deflection motifs because rook on h5 is hanging. In the case of knight e4, because they're just undermining this knight on f5, you just take on g7, take on e4, threatening on d6, and when they play d5, looks like black is fine. Crucial move is h6, such an important intermediary move to claim a huge positional advantage, and I believe it's already winning. After this, queen d7 takes here, and rook to g1. Rook on g1 defends the pawn on the 7th rank. Your bishop is way better than the knight. You can always consider pushing this pawn all the way up to h6 and h7. You want to make the long castle afterwards, or king e2, depending on circumstances over the board. And practically, white is winning. Finally, they have to go with the knight h5. And I'll show you a special line. Here I have two possibilities. I have a solid one that Grishchuk used against Movsesian with the queen f3, knight c6, bishop e3, and knight g3. White is a little bit better, nothing that special. He's got like long castle possibility, control of the d5 square. I like this for white, and it's okay. But there is something way more attractive, that after knight h5 is bishop h6. Bishop h6, which covers the rook on h8 and connectivity between the rook on h8 and the knight on h5. So when you play bishop h6, they can never take, because of course you take on h5, and you have a beautiful two knights against one good knight and extremely bad bishop. Positionally, black is completely destroyed. If knight c6, that happened in so many games, queen h5, knight e7 removing the knight, and when you take, if they take, you just go here, because they can't take by bishop, and exchanging the queens just leads to completely a winning position, because this knight will dominate the bishop. And finally, if bishop e7 castles rook h6, you just play queen e2. Once again, This is a slightly better version in comparison to the previous position, because here knight is so much better than the bishop, but there at least for black there is some hope because the queens are on the board still. We've seen e5 and hope that you like what I gave you there. And we just have to see a6 and knight c6 and h6. In the case of a6, we already saw very similar lines, but I'm just going to give you one more plan as an idea. Of course, that you kick the knight away with g5, develop your bishop with bishop e3. We already analyzed knight c6 with h4, but in the case of b5, there is a nice move. There is a nice move. Usually I don't teach my students to play the following move, but here we do it. They want to go with the bishop b7, they want to go with the b4, and they like to undermine the pawn on e4 right into the center. You play a3. a3 is a special move here. It stops b4, and after bishop b7, h4, knight c6, queen e2. Once again, we go with the same idea. I found a nice game played in Germany, like more than 20 years ago. The guy was an IM Heinemann. So look at his game. This guy played rook c8. And you always know when the rook is on c8 that they actually eye some rook c3 exchange sacrifices, especially considering the fact that if white plays long castle, but I believe a very nice move would be bishop h3 going after this weakness. Although he played long castle, as soon as he did it, black played rook c on e5. Look at this. He wants to sack on c3, an idea known in all these type of positions, but pretty much famous after the game Kasparov against Movsesian, where Movsesian was white and allowed Kasparov to sack on c3. And then Kasparov after the game said that it's something like chess culture to be familiar with the idea of rook c3 followed by d5, and that you're not supposed to allow something like that. Well, that depends on the style. Movsesian is a great player, and he tried to defend his position, but he got destroyed, let's be honest. Yes, I would never allow my opponent to sack on c3, especially because the pawn is on a3, but I don't like to, even if the pawn wasn't there, to allow them that. So this guy played f4, threatening the knight. You still cannot sack on c3 because f takes e5. And after knight c4, he played queen e1, overprotecting knight e1, and it's aimed against knight a3 because the guy was just threatening knight a3. After queen e1, queen c7, he once again threatens knight a3. Now bishop c4. Now knight b3. Knight b3 is a nice move, and he threatens knight a5. A very common idea in these positions when the queen and the bishop are on c4 and b7. So after queen c7, rook h2. I like this move. I like the idea of rook h2 because he defends and overprotects c2. He wants to have this rook doubled on either d file or e file depending on the moves in the game. But at the same time, he just wants to go with the h5 and g6 typical ideas. After bishop e7, h5, knight c5, captured, and now he used this idea of doubling the rooks. After b4, played rook to d7, played rook takes e7, and look at the finish of this game. This rook e7 was a very nice exchange sack. Then he played knight e5. He couldn't take because of e takes, and bishop c5 would be with almost mating, with a mating attack, and would be with a double check, so mate is inevitable. But after king e8, now this Heinemann played h6. That's what I like. Knight on d5 is untouchable, and he continues with the attack while black cannot castles. Also, he's just taking full control on the dark squares. And look what happened now. So after he went for h6, this guy captured, played knight f6, and played bishop c5. What a nice way to finish the game off. Of course, he couldn't take because of knight d7 fork. On king g7, the mate was coming in a different fashion. A beautiful game. And another game, instead of rook c8, one game played, black played knight d on e5. He's overprotecting c6, and he just wants to go with the knight on c4. After long castles, knight c4, I know how dangerous this looks. After knight c6, bishop takes c6, f4. That's what I told you in the beginning of this lecture. Sometimes you go h5, g6, but sometimes you go f4, f5. In this case, you just play f4 to get like more space. You're not afraid of any knight d3 because of queen e3, and they have lots of problems with a misplaced king. Standing in the center. But after queen a5, this guy threatened both knight a3, knight b2, knight looks threatened, king looks kind of weak. Everything was defended with a rook h3. That's a very nice defensive idea, but this guy played knight e5. He removes the knight from the center, jumps into the center of the board, and look what's happening. This guy played he takes d5, he takes d5, long castles, captures the bishop, plays bishop d4, and when this guy tried to sack the piece, played check. That's a nice intermediary move, captured on c4, won the piece, and black resigned the game. Very nice games with lots of attacking and pretty straightforward moves by white, but at the same time, I just have to be honest and to say that these positions require a bit nice defensive skills as well, because this is the double-edged type of game where we go on the king side while they go at the same time on the queen side. Not in most of these games, and in many of these games they will manage to do that, but when they do it, you will shake, believe me, and you won't feel so comfortable. Knight c6. On knight c6, I suggest, of course, g5. Always g5 when they'll allow you to do that. And here we have two plans. We have h4 and we have rook g1. Let me show you one nice game between two GMs with a rook g1. Efimov Naumkin. Rook g1, placing the rook on g1. I already told you that he would like to go with this rook on g3 and afterwards to go with this idea. Of course, you first have to play bishop e3 to overprotect the knight so the queen can leave its basic square. After a6, he played queen e2. He didn't want to go with a queen h5, played queen e2, knight e4, bishop d4, and just like you see in the whole lecture, my approach is mainly coped with a queen e2. Rook e8, queen h5, he now wants to go there, playing long castle, completing his development and preparing for the full attack, including one more rook into the action, and sacking on g7. What a beautiful game, because when this guy played like b takes e3, taking the knight, he just continued with rook f3, threatening on f7, played bishop c3, threatening rook f7 at the moment, rook f7, queen h7. So when black played rook h8, bishop f6, not allowing him any kind of defense, playing b4, removing white because he's threatening to, for example, play here. Actually, he's threatening checkmate in one move to mate the king, but after b4, he's opening up the king and played rook h3, and the mate was inevitable. Because after check, this one check, rook to b3, and black would be completely lost. And he resigned the game. Nice one, and once again shows that this whole plan code with a rook g1 is very interesting, and you can always consider that as an option. But here white went for h4, bishop e7, bishop e3, castles, and queen h5. In the beginning of this lecture, if you remember, I told you don't play queen h5 when the pawn is on h4. But in this position, you can do it because everything is just set for some very interesting sacrifices. After b5, f4, what's the point? When they play b4, here I have an improvement. I get a novelty that nobody ever played so far. It's bishop to d3. An idea of bishop to d3 is to push e5. So what's happening here? If they take on c3, you sack on g7 first. Sacking on g7 doesn't allow, it doesn't give them possibility to play g6. So after king g7, queen h6, e5, and it's mate. If they play g6 straight away, you play queen h6, threatening mate. And when they play e5, you go h5, and they can't stop h takes g6 with queen h7 mate. If they go e5, you go back to, you play knight e5, and when they take the bishop, you once again take advantage of this bishop on d3, go queen h5, and they can stop e6, f takes bishop g6, they can stop h5, h takes g6, they can stop knight f6 in some positions. It's mate. They gotta go with knight c5, you take, they take here, you go bishop b2, and here you know the golden rule. His pawn is actually keeping the safety of your king. You never touch it, and the file is on the b file, open b file is basically useless because b2 pawn is our biggest defender. Whole things considered, I showed you how do you have to play those 96 lines. I just have to conclude this lesson with the main move, and I'm going to show you a very popular lately move by white and the specialty in this Keres attack for white. So when they go with h6, h6 is aimed against g4. G5. There are so many possibilities. I opted to show you this rook g1 that was played massively by Nakamura. And idea is simple. You either want to play h4 followed by g5, or you just want to play bishop e3, complete your development, and afterwards either break with g5, because they can never play bishop e7 short castle since they committed themselves with h6. So g5 comes down with tempo, and it goes with a smooth kingside attack for white. Well, at the same time, you just want to go h4, g5, h6, h6, g6. After 96 bishop e3, a6, you play h4. They can't allow you to play g5 and g6. They would be just that. They gotta go with h5, that's the theory, and you take on h5. That's a theoretical position. And here, I'll just show you 3 correspondence games, actually 4. In all those 4 games, white managed to win those games pretty easily. In the case of rook h5, this is a little bit risky approach by black, because you play bishop g5, threatening bishop f6, and threatening to win the rook on h5. They gotta move it. And the specialty is knight c6 followed by queen f3. You want to go with long castles and e5 afterwards, but at the same time you want to push h5 because they can never touch the pawn on h5. You will threaten h5, h6. Another thing is after they play rook b8, long castles, queen b6, b3, it's a common way of safeguarding your king and creating like untouchable castle. After knight d7, queen g3, maybe even threaten some rook d6 at some point, king b1, king in the safety, bishop e2 hoping for h5. This guy played bishop d2 hoping for some knight d5, nice jump. Rook h1 going for h5 and opening up game on both fronts. G takes, bishop h5, going back there, queen f4, exchanging this rook, going rook h1, rook h6, and basically getting completely winning position. And what I like about this game, I just showed you like 29 moves. Most of these moves were just so logical by white. He hasn't, taken any special measures against the black's position, and the black was still, he remained completely lost. After knight h5, which is considered to be the best move for black, and that's why I put a green color in this knight on h5, I want to show you a specialty here that almost scores perfect for white. It's knight takes c6. Not in many Sicilian games you'll find variations where you take on c6 and create a structure like this. It's similar to some Taimanov structures, but at the same, because they have a full flexibility, also d5 and the b file open. But after you play queen d2, let me just show you 2 short lines. One guy played e5, wants to open up the light square bishop. Bishop c4 stops bishop e6. Plays queen takes h4, plays bishop g5, and who's going to tell me that the queen on h2 is standing well? White easily won this game afterwards. Played queen e3, jumped with the queen on b6, went straight into the heart of the black's position and won the game. In the case of queen c7, you just go f4, long castles, queen e1, and bishop e2. Absolutely nice, easy, and smooth development where black keeps the full flexibility and wide diversity of options. e5, f5, h5, so many other things, even bishop d4 in some lines. In most of these games, after knight c6, b takes, queen d2, black went for knight f6, long castles, and queen c7. After long castle, at some point you threaten e5. Not immediately yet, but okay, king b1, f4. Played f4, played queen e1. What I like about queen e1 is not that he goes for that just to defend this pawn. Who cares about this pawn, usually? It's more importantly because I want to open up my rook and the d file, but at some point I want to just keep an eye on this e5 break. In one game, instead of d5 by black, black went for g6, fixing the pawn on h4, bishop e2, played b3 to fully secure the position of the king on c1, played a3, kicking the rook away, king b1, and when this guy hoped for a moment that he had a nice game, played bishop d4, hoping for e5. Look at the following tactics. e5, captured on e5 and played queen g3. He now threatened on e5, only move is bishop d6, and now he played the beautiful move bishop a7, threatening both rook takes d6, consequently pawn on e5, and rook on b8. After rook b7, played rook g on f1, threatening this knight. After bishop e7, played another beautiful deflection move, bishop c1, and black resigned. What a nice game, you just have to admit. Position, if you ask me, if I just, like passing by the board where the game was played and somebody tell me how to assess my position, I would say, well, it's kind of unclear. Black also has his own chances, but believe it or not, after bishop d4, e5, queen g3, bishop a7, rook f1, he won this game in 4 moves. Crazy. And finally, last game for this lecture, if on queen e1 they go d5. d5 breaks in the center, but the king is misplaced on e8. It's still exposed in the center, but they open up the center, they open up the bishop, and they have the b file. So at first glance, it looks kind of risky. But after king b1, who would consider this option? Bishop b4, I would say, oh my goodness, this guy's gonna mate me every single move. Bishop g2, rook h7, defending on g7 in some moments. Bishop d4, threatening to take on d5. King f8, b3, always standard maneuver with the king's safety and against the rook on b8. Queen f2, threatening some bishop c5 at some point. That's what he did with the knight a4, prevented c5 at all costs. Bishop e5, exchanged everything, played e5, exchanged the bishop for the knight, and had absolutely fascinating control of the game and positionally dead lost for black, since the knight dominates and outplays the bishop. Guys, I hope that you enjoyed in the Keres attack, and hopefully you're just going to have so many nice wins with our lecture and attack that I tried to present you tonight. Have a good one and come up with some donations and subscribe on the channel. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.